It was past midnight in a lonely diner, when a tired Marine veteran sat quietly with nothing but a cup of black coffee and his loyal German shepherd. He thought the night would pass in silence until a wealthy tycoon walked in and grabbed the waitress by the wrist. Everyone else looked away, but not him. What the veteran didn't know was that this young waitress was hiding a secret that could change his life forever. And when the truth came out, the city shook, an empire fell, and a broken man discovered the miracle he never believed in. The city of Denver in late autumn was a place of sharp contrasts. By day, the mountains framed the horizon in cold majesty, their ridges already dusted with the season's first snow, while downtown streets echoed with the clamor of traffic and the neon glow of bars that promised escape from the chill. By night, the cold seemed to seep into the very bones of the city, carried on winds that howled down empty alleys and rattled the windows of apartments too small for the lives packed inside them. On this particular evening, the rain fell steady, a bitter sleet that hissed against the pavement and turned every puddle into a mirror of flickering streetlights. It was the kind of weather that made strangers pull their collars high and hurry past one another, eager to reach some place that felt like shelter. For Michael Harris, 36 years old, and carrying the weary frame of a man who had marched too many miles under heavier skies, shelter had become a concept more than a reality. He had once been a Marine, a scout platoon leader who had led men through the dust-blown villages of Iraq, where every corner carried danger and every decision carried a cost. Those days had carved lines into his face deeper than his years, set a sternness into his jaw, and left him with the kind of eyes, steel gray, always searching, that never seemed to fully rest. He wore his dark hair cropped short out of habit, though flecks of premature gray threaded through it now, and the stubble on his jaw was less style than exhaustion. A scar curved just under his chin, the legacy of shrapnel from a roadside blast. People who passed him on the street often glanced once and looked away quickly, sensing the aura of a man both present and absent, as though half of him still walked some battlefield far away. His only constant companion was Max, a 7-year-old German shepherd whose powerful frame and intelligent eyes mirrored the discipline of his master. Max's coat was a thick blend of sable and black, his ears always perked, his gait purposeful. Unlike Michael, he had no hesitation in how he moved through the world. Strangers often crossed the street when they saw the pair. Though Max was not aggressive, he carried himself with alert dignity, a soldier's dog accustomed to both loyalty and danger. Michael often said little to people but carried on long conversations with Max, as if the animal were the last bridge he trusted between himself and the rest of humanity. Together they occupied a cramped apartment on the fringes of the city, where the rent was barely manageable through odd jobs Michael picked up, hauling furniture, fixing fences, late-night shifts as security in warehouses that barely asked his name. He had tried for steady work, but the gaps in his resume, the mention of PTSD treatment, the wary glance at his military bearing, all closed doors before they opened. Each rejection pressed the same weight onto his shoulders, the gnawing sense that the war had taken not only his past, but stolen his future as well. That night, he found himself with nowhere particular to go between one job ending and another beginning, and so he walked aimlessly with Max at his side until the rain drove them into the glow of the Moonlight Diner, a chrome-sided relic of the 1950s that clung stubbornly to its corner of Colfax Avenue. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of grease and burnt coffee, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence between the occasional clatter of plates. The diner was nearly empty, just a trucker hunched over his meal at the far booth, and an elderly couple speaking softly by the window. It was the kind of place where time moved slower, where you could sit and no one hurried you along, and for Michael, that was reason enough to stop. He slid into a booth, his wet jacket creaking, and Max settled loyally at his feet, curling his body protectively near the table's edge. That was when she appeared at his side, order pad in hand. Emily Dawson introduced herself simply as Emily, with the practiced tone of someone who had repeated the same greeting 1,000 times in a single shift. She was 26, tall and slender, with a posture that carried both weariness and an innate grace. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail that revealed sharp cheekbones and eyes the color of summer skies, though shadowed with fatigue. Her skin was fair, almost too delicate for the harsh fluorescent lights, but she carried herself with a calm dignity that did not belong to the usual rush of diner staff. There was a precision in the way she spoke, a carefulness in how she set the coffee cup before him, as though every gesture had been considered before being made. To the casual observer, she was just another waitress, but Michael had spent too many years watching people in tense situations not to notice the details. She looked like someone who had been educated in places where voices were polished, someone who had not been born to late-night shifts and sticky floors. Yet here she was, pen poised, offering him the smallest of smiles that somehow felt genuine despite the exhaustion etched around her eyes. "Coffee?" she asked. Her voice was low, cultured, but softened by an effort to sound ordinary. Michael nodded, his throat too dry for words, and she poured. For a moment their eyes met, and in that fleeting instant something passed between them. His unspoken recognition of a woman out of place, her quiet acknowledgement of a man who carried invisible battles. Emily moved on to the elderly couple, her steps measured, shoulders squared against the endless fatigue of service work. Michael watched her go, not out of desire but curiosity, wondering what circumstances had brought someone like her to a place like this. He didn't ask. He never asked. The diner became a small sanctuary against the storm outside, the rain hammering the windows as if trying to claw its way in. Michael wrapped his hands around the chipped mug, the bitter coffee grounding him, while Max's steady breathing at his feet reminded him that not all bonds were fragile. He thought about the jobs waiting tomorrow, the bills stacked neatly on his counter, the neighbors who avoided his eyes in the hallway, and he felt the familiar weight of solitude pressing down. But for this moment, in the hum of neon and the quiet scrape of forks on plates, he was simply a man with a dog, in a diner, finding a sliver of peace. He had no idea that the woman who had just poured his coffee, with her tired smile and her name tag that read Emily, was in fact Emily Dawson, only daughter of Thomas Dawson, the billionaire whose empire shaped half the city's skyline. Nor could he imagine that their paths, crossing here on a night of rain and anonymity, would ignite a story that neither of them could have foreseen. For now there was only the storm outside, the warmth of the mug in his hands, the loyal weight of Max by his side, and the quiet presence of Emily moving between tables as though she belonged in this world, even though Michael already suspected she did not. The bell above the Moonlight Diner door gave a sharp metallic jingle as 3 men stepped inside, pushing the storm's damp air ahead of them. Their arrival changed the texture of the room, the way a sudden shadow changes the mood of a summer field. At the center of the trio strode Richard Moore, 40 years old, tall but gone soft in the way of men who spend more hours at banquets than in gyms. His hair, black-combed smooth with streaks of silver at the temples, gleamed under the fluorescent lights. His hazel eyes moved lazily across the diner, not searching, but appraising, weighing people as assets or obstacles. His clean-shaven jaw was strong, but the crooked curl of his lips revealed a lifetime of entitlement. Richard's reputation preceded him, a venture capitalist who prided himself on breaking competitors as easily as breaking bread, a man who treated power like a game in which only he knew the rules. To his left walked Derek Mills, a man built thick through the shoulders and neck, his frame straining the seams of his expensive charcoal suit. He carried the crooked nose of someone who had lost and won fights in equal measure, a pugilist turned bodyguard, always waiting for a nod from his employer. His heavy brow shadowed dark eyes that flicked toward every corner, like a wolf checking for rivals. On Richard's right lingered Jason Price, barely 25, tall and wiry, his suit jacket a touch too large as if borrowed from a more established man. His sandy blonde hair was carefully parted, his clean-shaven jawline still carried youth, and his pale blue eyes betrayed both ambition and nervousness. He was the type who watched his boss's every move, mirroring smirks and silences alike, desperate to prove he belonged. They chose a booth in the center like kings claiming territory, Richard sprawling wide across the seat, his associates flanking him like living walls. He snapped his fingers once, sharp and arrogant. Emily Dawson turned toward the sound. 26, tall and slender, she balanced grace with fatigue. Blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail that revealed her sharp cheekbones and clear blue eyes. Her fair skin seemed even paler under the diner's lights, but her posture was steady, practiced. She approached with menus tucked neatly to her side, her voice even and polite. "Good evening, gentlemen. I'll get that coffee right away. Would you like menus?" Richard smiled, a smile without warmth, then reached out and caught her wrist. His grip looked casual to the room, but landed heavy and unyielding on her slender arm. Emily's lips parted in surprise. Her breath caught, but her composure stayed, barely. At his booth near the edge, Michael Harris raised his steel-gray eyes. His lean frame shifted slightly, muscles coiling beneath his worn flannel. The scar under his jaw tightened, memory and instinct waking together. At his feet, Max, the German shepherd, perked up, ears sharp, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. The other patrons reacted with silence. The trucker in the corner rustled his newspaper higher, his shoulders tense. The elderly couple by the window gathered their things quickly, murmuring excuses. Behind the counter, the cook in his faded baseball cap turned the radio up, avoiding the scene. Michael set his mug down with a soft clink. He rose slowly, his broad shoulders squaring, his stance deliberate, the kind of calm that comes from walking through checkpoints in hostile lands. Max padded forward at his side, a silent sentinel. "I think the lady asked you to let go," Michael said, his voice calm, conversational, but under it lay the steel of command. Richard looked up, smirk widening. "This doesn't concern you, friend. Sit back down before you hurt yourself." Michael's gaze stayed locked on Richard's hand, gripping Emily's wrist. When a man puts his hands on a woman who doesn't want it, it becomes everyone's business. Derek shifted, his weight rolling onto his back foot, preparing to rise. Jason half stood, then faltered, his uncertainty written plain. Emily's eyes met Michael's briefly, gratitude flickering against fear. Richard leaned back, his grip unyielding. "Do you have any idea who I am?" His voice was velvet laced with threat. "I could ruin you with one call." Michael stepped closer, Max shadowing him, the air between them tightening like a drawn bow. "You're going to let go. Now." Richard tilted his head toward Derek. The stocky man rose, hand moving toward Michael's shoulder in a gesture meant to dismiss, to shove. Michael's body moved before thought could catch it. He pivoted, capturing Derek's wrist, twisting with precise efficiency, and in one fluid motion brought the man face down against the cold surface of the table. Derek's breath left him in a grunt, his arm locked in a control hold that promised pain without cruelty. Jason froze, half standing, hands uncertain. Max's amber eyes locked on him, teeth flashing just enough to hold him in place. The diner fell into breathless silence. The trucker lowered his paper an inch. The elderly woman clutched her husband's arm. The cook leaned forward over the counter. Michael's voice never rose. "Nobody here needs to get hurt. Let her go." Richard's hazel eyes darted to Emily, then to the quiet authority in Michael's stance. And for the first time, hesitation cracked his confidence. His fingers loosened from Emily's wrist. She stepped back quickly, rubbing the red marks on her skin, her chest rising with a shaky breath. Michael released Derek, who stumbled back clutching his shoulder, and straightened without fanfare. He stood there, calm but immovable, Max pressed against his leg like a second shadow. The clash was over in seconds, but the diner would remember much longer. The night a soldier stood when no one else would, and a waitress realized that someone saw her not as power's plaything, but as a human worth defending. Richard Moore did not let humiliation sit quietly. Men like him never did. The morning after the confrontation at the Moonlight Diner, Denver awoke under a sky the color of slate, snow swirling down in thick, wind-driven sheets that erased the skyline into a blur. News traveled fast in a city like this, and Richard's influence traveled faster. By noon, stories began appearing on local business blogs and social media feeds. A troubled veteran had attacked a respected investor in a late-night diner. Words like unstable, violent tendencies, and unfit for employment laced the headlines. They came with carefully chosen photographs. One of Michael Harris in uniform years ago, jaw set and rifle slung. Another grainy image of him leaving a VA clinic, his head lowered against the rain. For Michael, 36, already struggling to keep his balance in civilian life, it was another storm pressing against his ribs. His last reliable security job called that afternoon. The manager, a balding man named Frank Keller, in his 50s with sagging eyes and the habit of avoiding direct statements, sighed heavily through the phone. He explained there were liability concerns, that while he personally had nothing against Michael, the company couldn't risk bad optics. Frank had always been neutral, never unkind but never warm, a man more comfortable behind policies than people, and in that moment, his weakness showed. The words stung less than the finality of silence after he hung up. Another door closed. Michael spent the evening in his small apartment on the city's edge. The radiator clanged half-heartedly against the cold, leaving breath visible in the air. On the mantel above a narrow shelf sat a triangle-folded American flag in its wooden case, the only bright thing in the room, beside photographs of men in uniform who had once called him brother. Bills lay in stacked rows on the kitchen counter, paper soldiers in a war he was losing without even fighting. Max, 7 years old, thick sable coat bristling against the chill, sprawled on the worn rug, his amber eyes following Michael's every movement. The dog's calm was the anchor that kept him from sinking. The knock came after dark, a gentle rap against the thin wood of his door. Michael tensed, his hand brushing unconsciously against the scar under his chin. Max rose instantly, ears forward, body taut, until Michael murmured a quiet command and the shepherd relaxed a fraction. When he opened the door, snowflakes blew in on a sharp gust, framing Emily Dawson in the hallway light. She wore a wool coat 2 sizes too big, her blonde hair loose from its usual ponytail, cheeks reddened by the cold. In her hands, she carried a casserole dish wrapped clumsily in foil. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, her voice carrying both nerves and determination. Michael stepped aside. The apartment was small, its furniture worn but meticulously neat. Military order applied to civilian survival. Emily's eyes traveled across the photographs on the wall. The framed flag, the sparse kitchen, the careful stack of bills. She set the casserole on the counter, pulling her coat tighter as she absorbed the atmosphere of a man living on discipline alone. "You didn't have to come here," Michael said, his tone low, almost wary. "Yes, I did." Emily met his gaze, blue eyes shining in the dim light. "Richard won't stop. He's using his people to twist the story. But I wanted you to hear this from me. You didn't just help a waitress. You helped me, and I needed you to know I'm grateful." Michael studied her for a long moment. She was 26, tall and slender, her posture betraying both breeding and exhaustion. Yet here she was, standing in the apartment of a man she barely knew, offering food like an apology the world refused to give. He nodded once, a soldier's acknowledgement. They sat at the small table. Max settled at Emily's feet, warming to her presence as she reached down and let him sniff her hand before gently brushing her fingers along his thick fur. The casserole was simple, baked noodles with cheese, the kind of meal made in haste but offered with sincerity. For Michael, it tasted like something he had not known in years. Comfort. Conversation came slowly. Emily asked about Max, and Michael told her he had adopted the dog after returning stateside, trained him to be more than a companion, an anchor, a guardian, a reminder of loyalty untouched by the world's games. Emily listened, truly listened, her chin resting on her hand, her blue eyes never drifting toward the clock or her phone. When she spoke of herself, it was with caution. She told him she had been working at the diner for 3 months, not for money, but for clarity. She wanted to understand the lives lived outside her father's glass towers. She spoke of her degree in design, the expectations waiting for her at Dawson Tech, the weight of a name that opened every door but locked her into a life she did not choose. "In that diner," she whispered, "I feel more alive than in any boardroom." Snow battered the window, thick and relentless. Inside, warmth grew between them, not romantic but human. 2 people stripped of pretense, sharing the quiet of survival. Michael saw in her not a billionaire's daughter, but a woman reaching for authenticity. Emily saw in him not a broken soldier, but a man who carried scars with dignity, who still stood even when the world tried to push him down. When she left, the night had deepened. The snow piled thick along the streets. Max watched her go with calm acceptance, then curled at Michael's feet as he sat again at the table. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, for the first time in a long while, Michael felt a spark of something that looked like hope. The storm of lies did not subside. It thickened. Days after Emily had come to Michael's apartment, Denver lay buried in snow. The streets narrowed to slush channels between towering drifts. The city's pulse slowed, but not silenced. Richard Moore thrived in chaos. He hired men who were not just lawyers, but watchers. Men who followed Michael at a distance. Men who lingered too long near Bridget's school. Men who tested the edges of fear like jackals circling. Max, 7 years old, broad-shouldered and sable-coated, became Michael's early warning system. The German Shepherd would stiffen at windows, ears pricked toward the shadows beyond, a growl rolling from his chest whenever headlights idled too long outside. At night, Max would pace the apartment, restless until he settled at the foot of Bridget's small bed, amber eyes glowing like sentinels. Michael noticed the watchers, too. He had spent years training his eyes to read terrain, to catch what was out of place. The man with hands too clean to be waiting at a bus stop. The same sedan appearing on 3 different streets. His instincts told him Richard was escalating, pressing not just through media, but intimidation. Emily Dawson could no longer remain silent. She was 26, tall and willowy, her blonde hair no longer tucked into the practical ponytail of a waitress, but flowing freely as she began to step back into the world that was truly hers. The fatigue was still etched around her eyes, but behind it, determination was growing. She visited Michael again, her coat dusted with snow, her blue eyes alive with a fire that had been missing for months. "I can't keep pretending," she said. "It's not just your fight anymore. This is on me, too." Michael listened quietly, his jaw set, the scar under his chin a pale reminder of battles past. He tried to tell her the world she came from would turn against her, but Emily shook her head. "I've lived in silence long enough. It's time they knew who I am, and what really happened." The next morning, the city woke to headlines that cut through Richard's narrative. A press release carried Emily Dawson's name, not Sarah the waitress, but Emily Dawson, daughter of Thomas Dawson, CEO of Dawson Tech. It declared that she had been harassed and assaulted in a public diner, and that Michael Harris had stepped in to protect her. At first, the reaction was disbelief, then uproar. Journalists descended on Dawson Tech's headquarters, demanding answers. Thomas Dawson himself was forced into the light. 61, tall with broad shoulders that had not yet given way to age, he wore his gray hair close-cropped, his suits tailored so perfectly that not a seam seemed strained. His face was strong, a square jaw framed by deep lines at the corners of his mouth and eyes, not from laughter, but from years of hard negotiation. To the public, he was a man of relentless focus and a ruthlessness that built empires. To Emily, he was her father, a figure who had loved her, but struggled to understand her refusal to live within the lines he had drawn. When he appeared before the cameras, his voice carried the authority of decades spent commanding boardrooms. "The story circulating is incomplete," he said evenly. "We have reviewed the original footage from the Moonlight Diner's security system. What it shows is clear. My daughter was accosted, and Michael Harris intervened to defend her." Behind him, on a massive screen, the cleaned-up video played. The grainy glare was gone, replaced by clarity. The images showed Richard Moore's hand tightening around Emily's wrist, her face tightening in pain, the other patrons shrinking back. Then came Michael's calm approach, his steady words, and finally, the swift, controlled disarm of Derek, Richard's associate. The truth was visible frame by frame, undeniable. The revelation shook the room. Among those watching was Detective Alan Ruiz, a seasoned officer in his late 40s. Stocky and square-jawed, with salt and pepper stubble and dark eyes sharpened by years on the force, Ruiz was not a man swayed easily by money or names. His father, once a steelworker in Pueblo, had taught him that some lines could never be crossed. Ruiz had been investigating Richard quietly, gathering threads of harassment complaints buried under settlements. Now, with the footage public and Emily Dawson speaking openly, Ruiz had what he needed. He moved through the conference hall like a wall of certainty, his badge clipped at his belt, his winter coat dusted with snow. He stepped directly toward Richard, who stood near the front, lips thin and complexion pale under the fluorescent lights. "Richard Moore," Ruiz announced, his voice carrying across the hushed hall. "You're under arrest for assault, harassment, and intimidation." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed. Reporters surged forward like a tide. Richard sputtered, his hazel eyes darting from face to face, seeking rescue from connections that suddenly seemed to evaporate. Derek stood stiff at his side, his jaw clenched, while Jason shifted uneasily, his youth crumbling into fear. As Ruiz read the charges, Michael stood off stage, shoulders squared, Max pressed against his leg, the shepherd calm even as the room boiled. Emily was there too, not as a hidden waitress, but as herself, tall and unflinching beside her father. For the first time, the scales tipped. The truth had been dragged into the light, and Richard Moore's empire of fear began to collapse in front of the very cameras he once courted. Spring returned to Denver like a quiet forgiveness, melting the long winter into streams that sang along curbsides and softened the edges of the city's gray. The snowdrifts retreated from the sidewalks, revealing grass that fought its way back through the thaw. For Michael Harris, 36, the season carried with it something more than warmth. It carried the faint but unmistakable sense that life had not finished with him yet. Weeks after Richard Moore's arrest, the narrative shifted. No longer the disgraced veteran painted unstable by powerful media allies, Michael's name was being spoken differently. The Marine who stood up when no one else did. His quiet refusal to be bought, his loyalty to truth, and the fierce presence of Max at his side began to transform into a story that people wanted to believe in. It was Emily Dawson, however, who carried that story into action. Emily, 26, blonde hair shining in the sunlight when she walked into her father's conference rooms, had found her own strength in the crucible of exposure. No longer hiding behind the name tag of Sarah, she spoke openly about what had happened in the diner. Tall and graceful, with blue eyes that refused to look down, she used the power of her voice to demand something beyond personal justice. She proposed the Safe Workplace Initiative, a program designed to fight harassment in industries where silence had been currency for too long. Her father, Thomas Dawson, 61, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, could not deny her conviction. Though still brusque, still a man molded by decades of relentless deal-making, he respected her courage enough to fund the program publicly. Michael sat across from them in Dawson Tech's glass-walled office the morning the offer was made. Thomas's gaze was steady, his jaw locked, his tailored suit catching the city light. "Mr. Harris," he said, "I want you to run security for this program. Head of operations, training, protection. You'd be defending the very people who need it most." His voice carried no softness. Thomas was not a man who pleaded, but there was sincerity behind the steel. Michael's scar tightened as he weighed the offer. "I don't want your money," he said simply, his voice low but unwavering. Thomas's gray brows drew together. "Everyone wants money." "Not me," Michael answered. "I want to make sure what happened in that diner doesn't happen again. That's all." Emily, seated beside her father, touched his arm gently. "He's not saying no, Dad. He's saying yes, for the right reasons." Max sat at Michael's side through the meeting, thick sable coat gleaming in the sunlight pouring across the floor, amber eyes sharp. At 7 years old, he was still strong, his body taut with muscle, his loyalty etched in every movement. He had been there through the worst storms, and he was there now, silent but constant, when Michael nodded finally. "I'll do it, but not as an employee to a billionaire. As a man working beside your daughter." The Safe Workplace Initiative launched weeks later. Its first training held not in a sterile boardroom, but back where it all began, at the Moonlight Diner. The neon lights buzzed, the chrome booths polished for the occasion. Michael stood at the front, shoulders squared, his steel-gray eyes surveying a room full of managers, staff, and security officers from companies across the city. He wore no suit, only his simple flannel and jeans, the clothes of a man who had nothing to prove. Emily introduced him with words that carried weight, not because of her name, but because of the truth behind them. Michael taught not just the mechanics of intervention, stance, leverage, voice control, but the harder lesson: courage. "The hardest part isn't the hold or the strike," he told them, his voice steady. "It's standing up when your gut says look away. But when someone's being hurt and you can help, it's not someone else's problem. It's yours too." Max moved among the attendees during breaks, a silent partner to Michael's lessons, allowing nervous hands to rest on his strong back, reminding them of loyalty without words. Emily watched with pride from the back of the room, her blue eyes following Michael not with gratitude alone, but with respect. Weeks became months, and the program grew. Yet life, for Michael, was not only about conferences or policies. On a warm afternoon in City Park, sunlight catching in the branches above, he jogged alongside a small bicycle. The rider was his daughter, Grace Harris, 7 years old, dark hair tied back with a pink ribbon, her cheeks flushed with effort. Grace was slender, with bright brown eyes too old for her age, a child who had learned early to read her father's moods, to measure his silences. She wobbled as the training wheels finally came off, panic flashing across her face. "You've got it," Michael said, his long arm steadying the seat. His scar caught the light as he smiled, a rare softness easing the lines of his face. Max trotted beside them, ears perked, tail wagging in calm encouragement. Emily stood nearby on the path, her coat unbuttoned in the spring air, a quiet smile curving her lips. She watched as Grace pedaled forward, the bike straightening beneath her, confidence rising like a tide. Michael released the seat, and for the first time, Grace rode on her own, her laughter breaking across the park. She lifted her hands briefly in triumph, wobbling but staying upright, a tiny victory that meant more than all the headlines in the world. Michael jogged behind, his boots crunching on gravel, his voice carrying across the grass. "That's it, Grace, you're flying!" Emily's smile deepened. In that moment, she was not the daughter of a billionaire or the architect of a public program. She was simply a woman watching a man and his daughter carve something new out of brokenness. She stood in the sunlight, her heart opening to the vision of a family not bound by blood or names, but by choice. As Grace circled back, breathless with pride, Max barked once, sharp and joyful, the sound echoing across the park. Michael caught his daughter in his arms as she leapt off the bike, lifting her high against the blue sky. Emily stepped closer, her blonde hair brushing her shoulders, her blue eyes soft. In that circle of warmth, the veteran with his scars, the child with her laughter, the dog with his steadfast loyalty, and the woman with her newfound strength, something unspoken crystallized. They were not just survivors of a storm. They were becoming a family. And in the quiet that followed, Michael understood what spring had given him. Not just a new season, but a new beginning. Sometimes, the greatest miracles are not thunder from the heavens or dramatic rescues in the last second. Sometimes, they are simple moments when an ordinary person chooses to stand up, to protect, to love, even when the world looks away. Michael, Emily, Grace, and Max remind us that God's grace often works quietly, through courage, through kindness, through loyalty. And maybe in our everyday lives, each of us is given the same chance to defend someone weaker, to offer hope where there is none, to be the miracle that someone else is praying for. Because faith is not only in churches and prayers, it is in actions, in standing tall when it matters most. May God bless you and your families, keep you safe, and give you strength to be a light in someone's darkest night. If this story touched your heart, please share it with others. Leave a comment below about your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story of courage, faith, and love.